Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Today we're going to be exploring a possibility that could be right at our fingertips, one that could be alarming. Our guest joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today holds a Ph.D. in history from Purdue University with a specialization in military history. He is the author of more than 40 books, of which several have been New York Times bestsellers. His groundbreaking novel, 1 Second After, was published in 2009, is credited by many with helping to start the prepper movement by raising national awareness as to the potential threat of an attack via an electromagnetic pulse strike. He, along with other experts on terrorism and military situations in the Middle East, firmly believes that it is time that America took serious note of the threats leveled by ISIS, that we are their next target, and that is not only a question of if, it is now simply a question of when. His newest book is The Final Day is Coming. National security, technology, and politics fuse into a chilling glimpse into the future. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, William Forstchen. William, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Now, EMP, it's interesting. I was watching the movie Ocean's 11. And I like that scene where Don Cheadle, they were trying to figure out how do they actually break into this guy's casino and steal all of his money on a fight night. And he says, well, that's easy. We just need something called a pinch. So I think they go to Caltech University or something like that, and they get this small thing that looks like a small nuclear warhead, but what it does is as it goes off, it just basically shuts down all the electricity in Vegas for a brief moment in time, giving them that window to do so. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there's something out there like that.
I hate that movie.
You did what?
I hate that movie. A lot of folks have heard of Bill Nye, the Science Guy. About 10 years back, Bill actually did a short documentary on how Hollywood gets EMP wrong, and that movie is right at the top of the list. So if you could give me a minute, I'll run down what an EMP really is.
Absolutely.
Why it's such a national threat. EMP, shorthand for electromagnetic pulse, generated by detonating a small nuclear weapon above the Earth's atmosphere, about 250 miles out. When the weapon detonates, gamma ray bursts coming off of the bomb creates what's called the Compton effect. It sets up an electrostatic discharge in the Earth's atmosphere, cascades down, hits the Earth's surface, feeds through all the millions of miles of electrical wiring that crisscross our country and which our entire society is dependent on. Literally, we'll be blowing wires off of pylons, particularly your high-tension ones, shorting out transformers. It shuts down the power grid of the United States. And unlike Ocean's 11, the lights do not come back on 30 seconds later. The lights are gone. And a study done for Impact America, which is a group that's involved in this issue, the estimate is that 80% of our generating capacity would still be offline after 5 years. Now, here's the bad number, then I'm handing it back to you. According to congressional reports, 2004, 2008, which your listeners can pull up simply by Googling, congressional report EMP, 90% of all Americans would perish.
That's an alarming number.
Yeah. So I can imagine some of your listeners are going, okay, you got a tinfoil hat guy on today. Let me break down why that horrific casualty rate. Electricity is the fundamental building block of a modern civilization. Now, where did you get your water this morning? It came through electrical pumping. Where does the sanitation work after you drain the bathtub and flush the toilet? It goes back in through sanitation systems that clean it all up and filter it. All of that is gone. Every city in America becomes uninhabitable without water, without sanitation. Average community only has about 20 days' worth of food on hand. If our transportation grid's down, you're not shipping food across America anymore. Towns will begin to starve. Medication. You go to your pharmacy, the average pharmacy only has a couple of days' worth of medication on hand. They're relying on that FedEx truck, which gets, why is it carrying particular medications that day? Because of computer connections to the store. You lose command and control. you lose all of these things, it starts a massive die-off.
Now, it's interesting, too. I remember some time ago I was attending a breakfast. It was a Martin Luther King breakfast, and they had brought in a specialist on emergency preparation, and it was just after Hurricane Katrina.
Right.
And you could just feel the coldness in your body, just basically feeling like your life's blood was being drained out of you as you realized how much you really need to be prepared, especially for something as major as that. You start questioning, could I count on my family, or could I count on my neighbors or friends? What kind of a situation would I be in if I didn't prepare myself? And he was talking about just real basics, not to mention, the bigger things that, would make you more and more prepared. But, it's just really alarming just how unprepared a lot of people are, even for a small disaster, let alone a big one like this.
Yeah, you really hit it there. Katrina and Sandy should have really been wake-up calls. And no matter how catastrophic, ultimately, it was a local disaster. Now, I live in North Carolina. Within 24 hours after word started getting out of what Katrina did, I teach at a small Christian college. We already had a truckload of emergency supplies we were sending down to a sister church down there. Aid came pouring in from across America. Just 2 months ago, we were suffering from horrible forest fires up here in North Carolina, 80,000 acres. I was talking with a fire crew that had come in from Nevada. We had help coming in from all across America. Well, suppose all of America gets hit simultaneously. There's no help coming for any of us.
No, it's interesting, in your novel you talk about, for instance, as this attack has happened, people such as Mexico and China basically come into the United States and we start divvying up our land, that sort of a thing. What's going on there? How did you go about doing your research for this book? Because it seems so alarmingly real.
Okay. Again, I'm going to have to ask for 1 minute. Okay. And I'm glad we do have a little bit of time today. How all this got started, I was in D.C. on the day the congressional report came out on the threat of EMP, and it was like a tree falling in the forest and nobody was there. Nobody paid attention to it. I am friends with Newt Gingrich. Newt and I were talking about it that same day. He referred me over to the chair of the committee, Congressman Roscoe Bartlett. It was a bipartisan committee, by the way. This is a bipartisan issue. Roscoe hit it. He said, Bill, there's no constituency. There's no public understanding. It sounds like sci-fi. Therefore, we're not going to get support. So I was challenged. Put out a popular novel, maybe that's based on real facts. And I have to keep emphasizing real facts. I interviewed dozens of different experts, people. I got a lot of information from my local pharmacist about how the computer system works. When I go in, get a med filled, it goes into the computer, it goes up to the central warehouse, it goes to FedEx, and it's resupplied 2 days later. That pharmacist, at the end of the interview, she actually was crying. She said, my God, Bill, if this happened, I know how many people would die in our town in the first month. How many people would be in agony because of not having pain medication. It's a cascading series of events. So there was a lot of interviewing going on before I even started to write the book.
So let's give an idea, once the attack happens, what would happen in, let's say, a linear process of an hour, a day, a week, that sort of a thing?
Great question, sir. Thank you. Call it a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? You don't have oxygen, you're gone in 3 minutes.
Right.
Well, we have air, but what do we need next in that hierarchy? Water.
It'd be water, probably.
Yes, and we don't have the filtration systems running anymore. So within a matter of hours, you're going to start having panic of people storming into their local supermarkets and dollar stores, fighting over a bottle of water. We actually did see this with Katrina and with Sandy. Remember watching the news of lines blocks long for people to try to get in Starbucks so they could charge up a cell phone? People waiting $100 bills in McDonald's just to try and buy a pack of hamburgers? People fighting over just one bottle of water? So you lose your water, you lose your sanitation, That starts turning into a disaster within 5 to 7 days. People will start getting sick, gastrointestinal, and that makes the sanitation issue worse. Within about 2 weeks, your food supply is running out. What's in your freezer, you better eat it quick because it's just going to turn into a nasty-smelling goo in about 5 days. So you go into your cabinet, you're pulling out the canned food that's been there for 4 years. That's gone. Your supermarkets are stripped. A moral question. If your child is starving and somebody has a couple of McDonald's hamburgers and you ask them for one and they say no, how far would you go?
Right. I don't know how far I'd go for a McDonald's hamburger, but I guess if it's the only thing left. It's alarming to think McDonald's would be the last bastion of any food that would be available. But I guess if you can bury a Twinkie for 100 years, why not a McDonald's burger, right?
That's a very disturbing thought. Just a side story, I was in Iceland a couple of years ago. One of the delicacies there is rotting shark fin. They take a shark fin, they bury it for 6 months, they dig it up, and then they eat it. I did it. My friends just sat there flabbergasted. It was one of the worst things I've ever eaten. But I can show you how come in Iceland they were doing that? Because food supply in Iceland broke down several times over the last 1,000 years because of volcanic eruption, and so they're scrambling to find anything to eat. Imagine all of America scrambling like that.
I suppose that series, The Walking Dead, probably hits it right on the money, doesn't it?
Yeah, except that's fiction.
Right.
We're talking about a hard reality here, which is something we have never faced in America. Okay, a side story. Leningrad, the siege of Leningrad, World War II. I visited there about 25 years ago. 1.5 million people starved to death and died of disease in Leningrad during the siege. My host took me to a cemetery, very painful. She was the only survivor of her family. 700,000 people buried in one cemetery. Rations in Leningrad were reduced for civilians, 700 calories a day, made up of a couple of slices of bread, of which more than half of the bread was wood pulp. The cellulose would swell up in your stomach and kill the hunger pains, even as you starve to death.
Ooh, that doesn't sound very good.
We as Americans, we've had 150 years without a major catastrophe at a wide area, meaning the American Civil War. And remember, that one took about 700,000 dead, of which actually the majority was killed by disease.
Now, the question on this, too, is, for instance, in your novel, who is it that has the EMP device, if you will, that actually charges this attack?
Anyone in possession of nuclear weapons has the capacity to do an EMP strike by detonating the weapon in space. We have to get past thinking about nuclear weapons the way it was during the Cold War, city busters, the mushroom clouds. We and the Soviets both did a test in the 60s. Our test was called Starfish Prime, where we launched the weapon, put it up into space, detonated it. Power systems in Hawaii, 500 miles away, were going offline. Soviet test, the name for it is 184, Soviet test 184. Same thing in Kazakhstan. Well, thank heavens we've yet to have that type of massive nuclear exchange. But more and more dangerous players are getting nuclear weapons or have already acquired them. I always point straight at North Korea and Iran. We're told sometimes, gee, don't worry too much about North Korea. They only got 3 to 5 small ones. 3 to 5 small ones to cripple America in what the military calls an asymmetrical first strike.
You see, and that's what's alarming, and then you have to think, well, now, what would happen in response if we're not prepared?
I actually I've written 3 books on the subject. The first one is 1 Second After, came out 8 years ago, then 1 year after a year ago, and then I concluded the series 3 weeks ago with Final Day. I have a conversation take place in 1 Second After, which is a novel, but it's based on real fact. Towards the end of the book, some people come into my community from the outside, story is set in a real place, Black Mountain, North Carolina. And the person from the outside says, oh, yeah, we finally figured out who did it, and we turned their countries into glass. We completely retaliated. To which my main character, standing there numb, having watched so many around him die, says, so what difference does it make now?
Now, it's interesting because in your novel, The Final Day, we actually replace our government. So I guess the question would be, how prepared is our government, especially when it comes to national security matters?
I have to emphasize, I have no access to classified information. I have no security clearance. I don't want one, because if I had a security clearance, then somebody in the government has to vet everything I write. So I work strictly with unclassified or non-classified information. During the Cold War, we built a lot of fallback positions. One of them actually plays a role in the third book, called Site R, located only several miles outside of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. FEMA has a fallback position. We had the old NORAD Center, which, by the way, they are reconditioning, as you and I talk, to harden it against EMP. There's a number of government fallback positions. The question would be, how could they effectively run things after such a catastrophic event? Or could they run them at all?
And what conclusions were you able to come with?
I came into the third book with the fundamental question is, can the Constitution survive? I'm a very passionate constitutionalist. I'm a history professor. I teach, literally today, 2 hours from now, I'm going to be in a class where college students, I have them read the Constitution word for word. Can the Constitution survive that type of crisis? And that becomes the plot of the book. Are we going to have a top-down system that might step around the Constitution, or are we going to have people saying, no, we want to restore as best as possible what made America great before we were hit by this war?
So it's interesting how you get a mix of opinions on something like that. We have gone through, well, a good example is the American Civil War. Points of the Constitution were violated in order to ensure the survival of the Union. The Constitution basically remained intact. It did through World War II. I pray to God it continues to remain intact, because that's the bedrock that created this incredible country of ours. So now my question also is, as I believe I alluded to earlier, is it likely that China and Mexico may be allies that take American lands and resources after an EMP attack?
Well, that crops up a lot in Book 2, 1 year after. Let's put it this way. I mean, you're broadcasting right now from California. We get hit by an EMP and California loses 80-90% of its population. Suddenly in the San Francisco Bay comes a convoy of ships. We're here to help. We got food, we got medicine. We'll be a peacekeeping force. We're going to help you people put your feet, back on the ground and get going again. It's what America did in Europe after World War II, but we didn't do it as a conquest. Now, maybe China would do it out of very altruistic reasons, or maybe it would be, gee, we better stay here for 10, 20, 30 years and help you people get going again. So, because there's a vacuum. With most of the population gone and government broken down, I think a lot of people would stand on the docks and, understandably so, cheer as food and medicine is being offloaded.
But, and fundamentally, you'd be absolutely right no matter where it was coming from.
Yeah. It could be coming. It could be coming from Mars. We would still say, thank you. We really don't mind if you stay here for a while to help us get back on our feet.
Some time ago, I had a guest on the program, Matthew Stein, I believe. He wrote several books, one of the big ones, When Technology Fails, and he talked about an EMP strike, but interestingly enough, it wasn't from an on-Earth enemy, if you will, but it was actually the possibility of a sun and a solar flare output. You know, and you realize, you know, for instance, as you were saying, you had, you know, we were talking about Hurricane Sandy, and of course, it eludes me, the other one, so to speak. But you know you know, when you look at natural disasters locally, that's one thing. But this is something that can be actually not only, you know, America-wide, but actually global-wide. You know, and it's pretty alarming when you think about that. And so the first question is, you know, how prepared are we for something like that?
Okay, now you're hitting another one, and I think some of your listeners are going to go, gosh, I thought he was depressing this before. This guy is really depressing. It's called CME, coronal mass ejection. It happens all the time. The sun, on a regular basis, these high-energy explosions are blowing off the surface of the sun, streaming out into space. They travel slower than the speed of light. Back in 1859, a huge one hit the world, and it blew out the Victorian Internet. Telegraphy stations were literally catching on fire. Wires were melting off the poles. It's called the Carrington Event because the solar astronomer, by the way, Carrington, had photographed this flare a couple of days earlier, and he put the two pieces together. So the terminology today when people are talking about a CME, we refer to a Carrington level, you know, type of event. And if that happened and we got hit, it would be a global-wide catastrophe. Statistically, I hear pessimists saying we're due for one about every 75 years. Optimists are saying 150 to 200 years. Either way, that is a certainty. Sooner or later, our world will be hit by a major Carrington-level event, and we're absolutely unprepared for it.
And how should we prepare for something like that then?
Great question again. There's half a dozen things. Let's go top down. One, in the last 8 years, twice through the House of Representatives, what was known as the SHIELD Act went sailing through the House and then got stalled in the Senate. And one or two senators shelving a bill that was essential. The SHIELD Act would have started requiring upgrading and hardening and modernizing our electrical grid. The more bad numbers. Only about 15% of the major components of our electrical system are manufactured inside the United States. We don't have the industrial capacity to not only maintain our grid, but to actually stockpile spare parts in the event of a CME or an EMP for rapid recovery. Second, at a global level, we should be talking more about this. Let's set aside some of our differences, guys, because if the power goes out across Europe and so Russia, that's impacting all of us, and it's going to become very dangerous. Final point from the bottom up. Preppers tend to have a bit of a bad name because of crummy television shows. Preppers are people just like you and me. Isn't it not wise that maybe for starters you have a month or two of supplies on hand that, okay, you get hit by a hurricane, or as what's going on in California, you know, all the way last week with the weather. You get hit by flooding and systems are going down. You're not out on the street trying to find a bottle of water. You have a month, 2 months supply. And very importantly, if you need medication, you have those on hand. The more Americans that do that, the less chaos there will be, the easier it will be to start trying to put things back together again.
And it's interesting you say that. I remember years ago I interviewed with the gentleman who was pretty much attributed with discovering the Y2K problem. And he had written a book, and it was a fictional book called Nothing to Fear, and he was talking about preparedness. And it was really interesting because he was saying, you know, it isn't so much the Y2K that's the problem, it's the reaction to it. And I thought, you know, that's what it is, you know, that people will go nuts. And in fact, he opens even that novel where there's this compound, it's a private compound, there's several 55-gallon barrels of kerosene and this and that, and apparently he wasn't practicing safety very much because the whole compound blew up, basically because he was over-prepared. He says, that's the thing is people, as you're saying here, you don't panic. Prepare, make sure you have a couple of months of food. You've got a good, emergency kit supply, things like that. And that's one of the things Matthew Stein, many of the things he talks about in his book, When Technology Fails. It's basically a Boy Scout novel, and you realize how essential it is to just have basic skills in survival, and the basic things, and that if you have that you'll relax, at least enough that you'll be able to make better decisions on what to do next.
Let's go back to Y2K for a moment. I live up in a mountain holler up in the Smoky Mountains near Asheville, North Carolina. And I can remember one day a neighbor coming over and said, we're having a little community meeting about Y2K and we'd like you to join us. I felt we had the Y2K situation in hand, as we did. I attended the meeting, and I must confess, and I hope they're not listening to this program, I thought a couple of these people were, tinfoil hat crowd. But about a week before Y2K was supposed to hit, I suddenly went out and bought a bunch of extra stuff. That, in fact, has been a bit counterproductive for the EMP issue because people say, oh, yeah, there was all the panic about Y2K. Never happened. Well, EMP is different. Y2K, we had plenty of warning on it, and the programmers were working like crazy a year in advance to make sure it didn't turn into a problem. But it shows how vulnerable we were. But if you look at the complexity of computer networking now as compared to 1999, wow, it's a magnitude more complex, and we're more dependent on it.
It's just fascinating to be thinking about that, and it certainly raises the question to get people thinking, you should be prepared, learn more about things such as this, and how devastating they can be when you're not prepared. First of all, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program, but I'm wondering, is there a website people can find out more about the book and things like that?
Oh, sure. 1secondafter.com gives you, I feel, I'm proud of the site. It's not just that it's for a book or anything like that. I try to link people into information sources such as the government reports so they can get the hard facts. I also want to put a pitch in for Ted Koppel's book, Lights Out. You read my book, which is fiction, but it gives you a narrative of what happens to a family across the year, gets you thinking. Read Ted Koppel's book. And also all three of the books on this. They're available at BNN, Amazon, as they used to say, wherever better books are sold.
The book is The Final Day. Our guest today joining us, William Forster. Thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you so much for your time, and let's hope folks start getting prepared and we get the SHIELD Act passed this year.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
I want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and stay updated on what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 Radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.